back in. Today we're discussing our week 7 must plays of the week. So let's just get right to it. We're going to start with our top quarterback plays of the week, and we're going to talk about first Jared Goff versus the Bucs. Now, Goff is currently the QB 14, averaging 18.2 fantasy points per game. Efficiency-wise, Goff has been phenomenal. He ranks 8th in yards per attempt, 2nd in passer rating, and 1st in QBR. He also ranks 12th in fantasy points per dropback from a productivity standpoint. Goff ranks 10th in passing yards and 1st in passing touchdowns. The issue for him has basically been the Lions ranked 29th in pass attempts and 28th in pace of play. But next up for the Lions is a home matchup against a pass funnel Bucs. This game already has the second highest total on the slate with a 52.5-point total, and the Bucs allow 253 passing yards and over a touchdown and a half per game to opposing quarterbacks. Their 20.7 fantasy points per game ranks top 7 against quarterbacks. This game has extreme shootout potential and one that I want to play as many players from that I can and players that we're definitely going to be talking about throughout this video. So let's keep moving here. Let's move over to my next quarterback. It's going to be Justin Herbert. I feel like I've talked about him now for the last 2 or 3 weeks, but after 3 straight down weeks, Herbert and the Chargers had a bit of a bounce-back game last week. Herbert completed 76% of his passes for 264 yards and 2 scores for 19 fantasy points against the Dolphins. His 38 pass attempts were also encouraging after dropping back just 29 times the week prior against the Commanders. Herbert is now the QB 11 in fantasy points per game. And next up for the Chargers is a home matchup against one of the league's best offenses in the Colts. This game has already jumped from a 45.5-point total to a 48.5-point total, which is the 3rd highest total on this slate. The Chargers also have the 7th highest implied team total. In terms of matchup, the Colts are allowing 250 passing yards, which ranks 11th, and 1.67 passing touchdowns per game to opposing quarterbacks. We did just see this defense get shredded by Jacoby Brissett, Trey McBride, Zay Jones, and Greg Dortch for 320 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. I am firing up Herbert with confidence again this week. Now, keep moving here. I want to talk about some other quarterbacks that are probably maybe available in your league or quarterbacks that you're kind of making decisions on. And so I will say this week, it's not necessarily a great week for streaming quarterbacks. Like, there are some okay matchups, but there's not a ton of like, oh, slam dunk, easy matchup here for these quarterbacks. But that being said, I know people are going to be making decisions for guys like Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen, who are both on bye this week. So let's start off. We're going to talk about Matthew Stafford against the Jags. Now, last week against the Ravens, Stafford had his worst performance of the season, throwing for just 181 yards and 1 touchdown for just 9.3 fantasy points. It should be noted that he only had 26 pass attempts. The Rams basically played ball control offense, which hurt his overall output. Even with that, Stafford still ranks 1st in passing yards and 3rd in passing touchdowns, as well as 6th in yards per attempt and 9th in EPA per dropback. The Rams now head over to London to take on the Jaguars. This is a plus matchup for Stafford. Even if Puka Nacua does not play with an ankle injury, the Jags have allowed 266.2 passing yards per game, which is the 4th most, and 1.6 passing touchdowns per game as well, which ranks 10th most. Overall, they have given up 21 fantasy points per game, which is the 6th highest rate to quarterbacks this year. So I really have no problem playing Stafford this week. I will say this is a London game, and these London games can get kind of weird. But either way, I still really like Stafford this week. I think he's in a really good spot against the Jags. Next up, this is where things get a little gross. We're going to talk about Aaron Rodgers against the Bengals. To no one's surprise, the Steelers have been extremely run-heavy this year. They average about 29 pass plays per game, which ranks 31st. Despite how run-heavy they have been, Rodgers actually ranks 15th in fantasy points per dropbacks and has the 9th most passing touchdowns. Even with all of that, he's still just averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game, which ranks 22nd. Next up for the Steelers is a great matchup against the Bengals, who have allowed 268 passing yards and 2 touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks. Overall, they have allowed the 11th most fantasy points to the position. And so while it's a little bit gross this week, I still think Aaron Rodgers on Thursday Night Football is still in play. Now, a couple other options we could talk about. Spencer Rattler, this is an offense that is among the league leaders in terms of pass attempts and pace of play. So those are both positives. The Bears defense can be had through the air. So with all of that said, I think Spencer Rattler, if you're really desperate this week or in 2 quarterback leagues, I think you would look at someone like Spencer Rattler. And then Michael Penix is the other option as well, going up against the 49ers. Now, the 49ers defense has actually been pretty decent this year, but they've just taken so many injuries. Already lost Nick Bosa. Now they've lost Fred Warner. You just can't overcome this many injuries, even as well as this defense has played and as good as Robert Saleh has done coaching this defense. So I do think Michael Penix is in play, but it's really going to depend on how much the 49ers are able to push them to see how much they actually throw the ball. But I think Penix is also another streaming option that we could look at this week. So over to the running back position, and we're going to talk Quinshon Judkins versus the Dolphins. Last week was easily Judkins' worst game of the season. He carried the ball 16 times for just 36 yards. He was also only targeted 1 time and ended up with a measly 3.6 fantasy points. His lack of involvement in the passing game will continue to limit his ceiling because anytime the Browns fall behind, he will get game scripted out. Good news this week, though, is the Browns are a rare 2.5-point favorite against one of the worst run defenses in the league, and the Dolphins. The Dolphins have allowed 134.3 rushing yards per game, which is easily the most in the league. Overall, they've allowed the fifth most PPR points to running backs. Judkins is a top 10 running back for me this week. Keep moving here, and let's talk about one of the hottest topics of the week, and that is Rico Dowdle and the situation with Chuba Hubbard. Rico Dowdle has been an absolute monster the last 2 weeks with Chuba Hubbard out. He scored 32.4 and 33.9 PPR points. He's racked up 473 yards and 2 scores, and he's been targeted 9 times, handled 80% of the snaps. Now, on the year, Dowdle ranks 3rd in yards per touch, 7th in explosive run rate, 16th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 1st in EPA per rush. Now, Chuba Hubbard did return to practice today after missing the last few weeks with a calf injury. The big question will be whether he takes back the reins as the lead back, or will Rico Dowdle continue to dominate touches in this backfield. I think it says a lot with the way head coach Dave Canales has handled the situation, because he's actually been asked twice already if Hubbard will be the RB1. Both times he refused to answer the question. I think he answered it without answering. I think if they were planning on Chuba Hubbard being the lead back, they just would have came out and said it, considering he was the lead back prior to this. I just don't see a scenario where you could go back to Chuba Hubbard as the lead back in this backfield. Rico Dowdle has played out of his mind, and I just don't see how they go back to doing that. At the very worst, I see a 60-40 split in favor of Rico Dowdle. But either way, I think this is a very favorable matchup against the Jets, who have allowed the 10th most rushing touchdowns on the year to running backs. And I think game script is also going to be in their favor in this one. So I don't think you can put this genie back in the bottle with Rico Dowdle. So I'm firing him up with absolute confidence again this week. Keep moving here. Let's move over to Jacory-Croskey-Merritt against the Cowboys. After a breakout performance in week 5, Bill came crashing back to earth, scoring just 5.8 PPR points. He did play 66% of the snaps, which is easily the highest of the season. He also ran the ball 17 times and ran 48% of the routes, which is also a season high. Volume is always king in fantasy football, and if this usage continues, he will be a huge asset the rest of the year. Next up for the Commanders is a matchup against the Cowboys. This game is a ridiculous 55-point total. The Cowboys have absolutely been dreadful this year. They've allowed 110 rushing yards, 60 receiving yards, and a touchdown per game to running backs. Overall, they are allowing 29.5 PPR points, which is the 3rd most allowed to running backs. So Jacory-Croskey-Merritt, I know, it was a down week last week. I know he didn't produce the way we were hoping him to, but I fully expect him to continue this role, and I think he's going to have a really, really good week this week. Keep moving here. Let's move over to Jaylen Warren versus the Bengals. Warren returned last week after their bye and missing a game. He played 55% of the snaps, had 11 carries, and ran around on 43% of the dropbacks. I think he finished with 63 total yards. Obviously nothing special, but that was against one of the best run defenses in the league in the Cleveland Browns. This week, Warren gets to face one of the worst run defenses in the league, though, in the Bengals. The Bengals have been thrashed for the 2nd most rushing yards, 10 total touchdowns, and 33.1 PPR points to running back, which is easily most in the league. Jaylen Warren is a top 15 running back, and I also think Kenneth Gainwell is a usable flex option as well this week. Let's keep moving here, and we're going to talk about something that I think most people have left for dead, and that's going to be Isiah Pacheco. Sometimes looking at usage numbers can be more encouraging than production. Pacheco has actually looked quietly like the workhorse in this backfield. We have seen a steady increase the last 2 weeks. In week 5, he handled 62% of the snaps and ran 41% of the routes. But in week 6, we saw a pretty big jump where he played 75% of the snaps and ran 69% of the routes. These are workhorse type numbers. Andy Reid himself has spoken recently about wanting to get him more involved. They really like what they've seen from him recently. While anyone who owns him has likely left him for dead on their bench, and I think this week could be a true breakout game for him. The Chiefs are a heavy 11.5-point favorites at home against the Raiders. The Raiders have allowed the 3rd most touchdowns, as well as 4.2 yards per carry, which ranks top 15. If you're looking for a flex option this week, I think Pacheco fits that bill and somebody that I am looking to fire up. I know that the production necessarily hasn't been there. He only has 1 game, I think, this year of double-digit fantasy production. I think what you're starting to see, if you've watched any of the Chiefs games, you're starting to see him look like his old self. Some of that juice is starting to come back. And what the biggest problem was is he was starting to lose opportunity in the red zone and goal line work. But we saw last week him actually get 4 red zone touches, which is the most he's had all year. Previous to that, he only had 4 red zone touches all year. He got that in 1 game last week. So I think the tides might be turning here for Isiah Pacheco, and I really think this is the spot to really play him this week against the Raiders. So to keep moving here, let's move over to some of our flex options. First, I want to talk about Alvin Kamara. Now, he has been nothing more than a flex option. The last 2 weeks, his role has really been reduced to a 50-50 split. The return of Taysom Hills will also limit his potential of a goal line carries. Kamara is averaging 13.8 carries, but a decent 4.3 targets per game. He is currently the RB27 in fantasy points per game. This is likely the new norm for Kamara. But this week, Kamara gets a good matchup against a Bears defense that has allowed the seventh most PPR points to opposing running backs. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to Jordan Mason. Mason remains a game script dependent. The Vikings refuse to use him in the passing game. He's only been targeted 11 times. He's been limited to 38% of the routes. He's currently RB25 in fantasy points per game and will be touchdown dependent. This week, he faces an Eagles defense that's actually been pretty susceptible to running backs, allowing the eighth most PPR points. So I do think Jordan Mason is a solid flex option. And then lastly, Rhamondre Stevenson was horrible last week despite 70% of the snaps. He ran the ball 13 times and was targeted once for 18 yards. However, this week, the Pats are 7-point road favorites against the Titans defense that has allowed the fourth most PPR points to running backs. Rhamondre is always hard to trust, but if his usage remains, he's a worthy flex spot this week. Now, as far as Travion Henderson, I think you can play him if you're desperate, but just the volume hasn't been there. And honestly, the production hasn't been there. And I think that's been the biggest reason why he hasn't played more. I think if he was out there ripping off big gains, even on a limited workload, I think they would actually force the hands of the Patriots. But considering he hasn't looked good, like he just so far this year, I think that's been the biggest reason why his opportunity hasn't jumped, despite the fact that Rhamondre Stevenson hasn't looked good. So that being said, if Rhamondre Stevenson is going to keep playing 70% of the snaps, I think he's at least a worthy flex option on this week. So let's keep moving here. Let's move over to the wide receiver position. We're going to start with Rashee Rice versus the Raiders. The prodigal son has returned from a 6-week suspension. It's been over a year since the last time we had Rice in the field. But let's not forget, the last time we saw him, he was seeing a 34% target per route run rate and was averaging 21 PPR points per game. There have been early reports the Chiefs plan to heavily involve him right out of the gate. You really couldn't have asked for a better matchup either against the Raiders, who have allowed the fifth most PPR points to wide receivers. I do think there's probably going to be some ramp up a little bit here. I don't think he's going to play 100% of the snaps. I would guess more he's probably going to be 70 to 80% at worst. But regardless of that, he's going to see 7 to 9 targets in this game. I fully believe in this matchup against the Raiders that he is a very borderline wide receiver one right out of the gate. So let's keep moving here. We're going to move over to Jaylen Waddle. Since losing Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle is averaging 8.5 targets, 6 receptions, 105 receiving yards, and 19.5 PPR points per game. From an efficiency perspective, his 2.38 yards per route run, ranked 16th, and he's 18th in yards per team pass attempt. Waddle looks like a locked-in, high-end wide receiver 2 this week against a Browns defense that has allowed the 4th most touchdowns and the 17th most PPR points to the position. Keep moving here. Let's move over to Quinton Johnston. After missing last week, QJ was back at practice today, which was a very positive sign, and barring any setbacks, should return this week. Johnson is currently the wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game. He's averaging 8.2 targets, 75.2 receiving yards, and nearly a touchdown per game. He also ranks 23rd in yard per route run and 16th in yards per team pass attempts. Things set up nicely in his return, facing a Colts defense that has allowed the 4th most receiving yards, the 7th most touchdowns, and the 4th most PPR points per game to the position. Johnson continues to be a strong wide receiver 2 heading into week 7. Move over to T. Higgins versus the Steelers. With Joe Flacco now under center, Higgins actually saw 8 targets, which was tied for the most he's received all year. He hauled in 5 of those for 62 yards. Obviously nothing special, but the Bengals get a better matchup this week against a Steelers secondary that has allowed the 9th most PPR points to wide receivers. While things have not been great this year since Joe Burrow left for the Bengals weapons, Joe Flacco at least has showed he can make them relevant compared to Jake Browning. Higgins is a high-end wide receiver 3 for me this week. Let's keep moving. Move over to Jameson Williams versus the Bucs. It's been an extremely boom or bust this season. He has 2 wide receiver 1 weeks, but he has 4 weeks of being wide receiver 57, 59, 64, and 89. His role has been extremely frustrating as he's basically just been a deep ball merchant. He ranks top 10 in deep targets, market share of air yards, and yards per reception. This is an extremely volatile profile. However, we did see a shift last week against the Chiefs. His 17.1 average at the target dropped all the way down to 7.3. And he also saw 7 targets and turned that into 66 yards and a score for 18.6 PPR points. If this continues, Williams will start to rack up some usable weeks. I think this trend will continue, though, this week against a Bucs secondary that has allowed the 10th most receiving yards and the 15th most receiving touchdowns to wide receivers. Plus, as previously mentioned, this game environment is an absolute shootout written all over it. I want to play everybody that I can from this game. Now, as far as some flex options, some little bit deeper type plays, I think Zay Jones, the first one to mention, if Marvin Harrison is out this week, Zay Jones should continue to play and expand a role in the offense. Last week, he saw a season-high 8 targets and turned that into 5 catches for 79 yards against the Colts. Fire up Zay as a wide receiver 4 flex play this week. Now, as far as the Bucs wide receivers are concerned, it appears Mike Evans will set to return this week. This is obviously huge news considering Chris Godwin and Emeka Egbuka are both likely out. Evans is a locked-in wide receiver 1. However, I think Tez Johnson becomes an interesting play. Tez played 73% of the snaps and ran 88% of the routes. The Lions secondary has been ravaged by injuries. I want to play Bucs wide receivers. So Evans, Tez, and Sterling Shepard all have some appeal to me. Next up is going to be Jordan Whittington, and it looks like Puka Nacua will be out. Devontae Adams is a top 5 wide receiver, but I think Jordan Whittington plays the Puka Nacua role here. Last season, he had 2 games with Puka Nacua out where he played 90% of the snaps and received 18 targets. He finished with 12.2 and 15.9 PPR points. Whittington is another flex play for me, but there's obviously some volatility here. And then lastly, Luther Burden. We will need to monitor the situation of DJ Moore this week, who had to stay overnight with being what is described as a groin injury. His status is listed as day-to-day. If DJ Moore misses, I would expect for Burden to see a huge bump from the 40% of the routes that he saw against the Commanders. Burden would slot in as a wide receiver 4 for me against the Saints. Now, go over to the tight end position. First, we're going to talk about is Harold Fannin versus the Dolphins. This has more to do with David Njoku's injury than anything. Last week when Njoku went down, Fannin's 42 routes were easily the most routes he has run in a game all year. He turned that into 7 catches, 81 yards on 10 targets. Fannin already has 3 weeks of double-digit fantasy points. With Njoku potentially out, he becomes an easy tight end 1 for me against one of the worst defenses in the league. Now, the Dolphins have allowed the 9th most receptions, the 3rd most receiving yards, the 7th most touchdowns, and the 8th most PPR points to tight end. So Harold Fannin would be a locked-in tight end 1 for me. Next up is going to be Mason Taylor versus the Panthers. Last week was a disaster for the entire Jets offense. Fields only threw the ball 17 times, which makes it really hard for any player to do a whole lot. Well, heading into week 7, it looks like Garrett Wilson will miss a few weeks, meaning Taylor could see a monster role in this offense. He's already top 12 in targets, the 4th in routes run among tight ends. Now factor in this amazing matchup, and you get a tight end in an incredible spot. The Panthers have allowed the most receiving yards, the 7th most touchdowns, and 2nd most PPR points to tight ends. So I will be firing up Mason Taylor with confidence as well. Now, as far as a few other deeper plays, I think one you could look at is Noah Fant versus the Steelers. A little bit thinner, but Mike Gesicki is expected to miss multiple games, and Tanner Hudson is in concussion protocol. With this game being on Thursday, I highly doubt he plays. Noah Fant remains the only tight end left. He's likely 3rd or 4th in the pecking order for targets, but this schematic matchup is definitely there, as the Steelers have allowed the 7th most receiving yards, the 8th most touchdowns, and the 4th most PPR points to the position. So Noah Fant, again, some volatility here because where he is in terms of the overall pecking order in the offense that he is with Joe Flacco. But still, if you're desperate for a tight end, I think Noah Fant makes some sense. Other guys I think you can look at is Cade Otton. Already talked about this game, talked about the situation. He has seen a bump the last couple of weeks as well. I think Cade Otton's in play as like a top 15-ish wide tight end. And then Chig Okonkwo versus the Patriots saw a bump last week. But this is a good matchup. The Patriots have allowed the 6th most PPR points to tight end. So I think that is the last guy I really want to hit on. That being said, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. I'm sure to help you out. Get your team ready for week 7 before the big bye again comes in week 8 when you have 6 teams on bye. So enjoy this week because next week is going to be absolute chaos with all the teams that are on bye. So be sure to hit that like, hit that subscribe. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.